guys, welcome back to Fragments of Faith. Before we get into anything else, we want to name something honestly. Uh, the last episode stirred up a lot, not just for listeners, but for us. So in this episode, we're just gonna kind of jump right in. We talked about questions that people aren't supposed to ask, and if you listened all the way through, you probably noticed something. We didn't actually answer many of them. That was intentional, but it also created a real tension because when questions come from lived pain, reframing them can feel like avoidance. So, so I want to say this clearly at the start. We're not backing away from the questions. Uh, this episode, we're actually going to step closer to them. Last time, I spent time talking about what questions do to faith, how they reshape trust, how they reshape authority and relationship. But today, I want to sit inside a few of those questions themselves, not to rush the answers, not to debate, um, and definitely not to pretend everything's going to be resolved because we know that's not what this is about, but to respond honestly and slowly and faithfully.
And I want to say something from my side before we go any further. When I said those questions out loud, they weren't theoretical for me. They were things I was curious about in a very real way. They came from prayer that didn't change anything, from silence that stretched on and never seemed to end. It came from moments where faith didn't feel comforting. So when we finished recording, part of me was like, okay, but you didn't actually go there. Not because I want like a list of answers, but because I wanted to know if those questions could actually be engaged and not just reframed.
And that's fair. I think your actual words were, "You sure dodged a lot of questions tonight." But here's the truth: naming the framework without engaging the content can feel like distance. So after you said that, even though you say you're joking, you're just trying to get me riled up. Um, Today is about closing that gap because as I did the edits, as I went back and listened, uh, I got where you were coming from. So I'm not going to try to answer every question you raised because that wouldn't be responsible and it wouldn't be honest. Um, some of them deserve entire conversations of their own, but I think together we've kind of talked and we've chosen a few that sit at the center, the ones that keep coming back, the ones that shape everything else. So in this episode, we're going to take them seriously, not with polished certainty, but and not with soundbite theology, but with real responses from where we actually stand.
And I just want to be clear, this is not about winning an argument. For me, it's about whether faith can survive being spoken about honestly without it being protected or defended or cleaned up too quickly. Because if faith can't hold questions like these, then it doesn't feel like faith anymore. It almost feels fragile.
And from my side, I want to say this plainly: I believe faith can hold these questions, but I also believe that the way we ask them and what we expect them to do matters. So today, we're not trying to fix the tension. We're staying with it. We're choosing a few questions. We're sitting with them together and letting this conversation be what it is. So so let's just jump right in. Let's start with the question that sits underneath so many of the others. It's not the loudest one. It's probably not the most controversial one, but it's the one that quietly reshapes how everything else feels. Because once this question starts forming, prayer itself changes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this question didn't start as doubt. I mean, it just started as confusion. I had prayed for things that mattered to me very deeply, not small things. I mean, I prayed for healing. I prayed for more time. I prayed for relief. And over time, I started realizing that whether I prayed or not, the outcome was not going to change. So the question wasn't, does God hear me? It was a little different than that. It was, if God already knows what's going to happen, if the outcome is already set, what is prayer actually for? Because when prayer stops feeling like it does anything, it doesn't just affect prayer, it affects trust because prayer used to be the place where I felt heard. It was the thing that made me believe there was an interaction. It also affects honesty because if I start to suspect the outcome is fixed, I start filtering what I'm asking for. So it affects whether I keep showing up at all. And I didn't know how to ask that question without it sounding like I was giving something up. And that question matters to me because I didn't pray casually. Like I prayed when everything was on the line. I prayed when my children were dying. And I prayed when I needed that ending to change. So if the ending was always going to be the ending, then what was I doing all of those nights? That's why this question just won't leave me alone because it felt like bargaining. It felt like, okay, if you won't heal them, will you at least slow this down? And then when that didn't happen, can you just give them some comfort, some pain relief? And then when that didn't happen, can you just give me strength? And every time the request got smaller, quieter, less bold, until I wasn't asking for miracles anymore. I was just asking to survive the inevitable. I mean, that shift does something to you. Unanswered prayer doesn't feel mysterious. Like it feels very exposing. It feels like you're on the floor offering everything you have: faith, hope, desperation, and still nothing moves. It feels like talking into the dark and not knowing if anyone is actually on the other side. I mean, it feels like hoping anyway, but it also feels like bracing for a no. And that's why this question matters, because if the outcome was never going to change, then why was I just wearing myself down? Was I slowly adjusting to a reality that had already been decided? Like I'm not trying to figure out what prayer means. I'm not trying to understand why it felt like I was negotiating with silence, because when you're literally begging for your children to live, you're not really trying to grow spiritually. I mean, you're not trying to align yourself. You want intervention. You want rescue. You want the story to be rewritten. You want that miracle. So when that doesn't happen, prayer stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like, I don't know, surrender in slow motion, I guess. And that's where I'm living at right now. Like if God already knew, what was the point for all of my pleading? I don't know what prayer is anymore, but I know what it felt like to ask and watch the ending come anyway. And that feeling kind of changes everything.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like bargaining to me. When you describe those nights, that pleading, that shrinking of the requests, that doesn't sound like somebody bargaining with God. It sounds like somebody clinging to him. And there's a difference. Bargaining tries to control the outcome. Clinging happens when control is already gone. And what you described doesn't sound transactional to me. It sounds desperate. And desperation is not a lack of faith. It's what faith looks like when everything else has collapsed. Now the question underneath all of that is the one that won't go away. If God already knew the ending, what was the point of the pleading? that question assumes something very natural, that prayer exists to change outcomes. And sometimes it does. Scripture shows moments where God responds in ways that alter circumstances, but scripture also shows something else, something we don't talk about as often. But prayer is not presented primarily as leverage over God. It's presented as participation with him. There's a verse in James chapter 4, it's verse 2. It says, "You do not have because you do not ask." And that verse it's been misused. It's been used a lot of times by people to pressure people as if the right words will change everything. But I don't think that's what James is doing. The point isn't that prayer forces God's hand. It's that asking matters because relationship matters. Prayer is not about informing God of things he doesn't know. It's about bringing our hearts into the reality of his presence. And I know how thin that can sound in the middle of loss, because when you're praying for your children to live, you're not trying to participate in theology. You're asking for a rescue. You're asking for intervention. You're asking for the story to change. And when it doesn't change, prayer can start to feel pointless. But here's where I kind of want to push back gently a little bit. If the ending was always going to be the ending, that doesn't mean the pleading was meaningless. It means the relationship was real. Prayer is not wasted because the outcome didn't move. Those nights weren't negotiation with silence, they were communion in agony. You were not adjusting to an inevitable reality, you were refusing to walk through it alone. There's a difference in prayer changing events and prayer changing the one who's praying. And I don't mean that in a grow stronger way. I mean this. Prayer keeps the relationship open when pain tempts you to close it. You weren't bargaining your faith away. You were bringing your desperation to God instead of somewhere else. And that matters. Now, does that resolve the tension? No, not at all. Not at all. Because we still live with the reality that some prayers are answered with intervention and some are not. And scripture doesn't give us the formula for why, but it does give us this. Prayer is not proof that we control the ending. It's proof that we trust God enough to speak before it arrives. And that doesn't make the loss smaller, it makes the relationship visible. And I think that's the part we underestimate. Prayer is not about rewriting the story. It's about refusing to step out of it when it hurts. And that leads kind of directly into something else you said, because when intervention doesn't come, then another question kind of rises up underneath it. And this one's even harder. If God receives the praise when things go right, why does he seem absent from responsibility when they don't? So let's talk about that.
Well, that question kind of feels dangerous. I mean, not because it's cruel. I mean, not because it's rebellious, but I kind of feel like it crosses an invisible line. It feels like the kind of question you're not supposed to say out loud. I mean, the air kind of changes when you say it. Like you could feel people brace. You can feel their discomfort. You can feel that subtle shift from grieving mother to problematic believer. I think that's why it feels dangerous because asking it out loud, it sounds like an accusation. And in faith spaces, accusation towards God is seen as a betrayal. So even forming that question makes my chest kind of just like tighten a little bit. Like it feels like I'm stepping out onto thin ice. Like I could lose credibility. I could lose belonging, lose the benefit of the doubt. But it's unavoidable because when you live through loss like mine, the question shows up whether you invite it or not. If God is credited for all the good, then the absence of good doesn't just disappear. I mean, it sits there. And pretending I don't feel the inconsistency feels kind of dishonest. So the question keeps surfacing. I mean, persistently, even when I try to push it down. And here's the other part: how blame gets redirected towards the sufferer. That part feels subtle at first. I mean, no one says, like, hey, this is your fault, but you get suggestions, maybe there's a lesson. Maybe God is shaping you. Maybe your faith will grow through this, or everything happens for a reason. And without saying it outright, the weight kind of shifts. Suddenly, the focus isn't on the loss, it's on how am I responding to the loss? Am I trusting enough? Am I surrendering enough? Am I worshiping anyway? It feels like the burden quietly moves from God's sovereignty to my spiritual performance. Almost, I mean, if the miracle didn't happen, maybe the issue is how I'm processing it. Maybe I need to have more faith or more peace, more acceptance. And that kind of takes me off because I'm already carrying grief. And now I'm also carrying the unspoken pressure to handle all of this correctly. It feels like instead of being allowed to say, this really sucks, this hurts, and I don't know why my kids had to go through that, I'm nudged towards make sure you respond the right way. And that's exhausting because the loss wasn't something I caused, but somehow the responsibility for making sense of it lands on me. And that's why this question feels dangerous. But I mean, it's still unavoidable because once you've lived through devastation, you can't unsee this tension of a double standard. I mean, pretending it's not there feels like lying to myself.
Hey, I'm gonna jump in here and tell you that I don't think that question is betrayal. I don't think it's cruel. I don't think it disqualifies you from belonging. I don't think what makes it feel dangerous is the question itself. I think it's what we've been taught the question implies. Um, we've been trained to hear it as accusation. But there's a difference between accusing God and struggling to understand Him. And I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to protect God from the question, but I want to protect the question from turning into something it doesn't need to become. You said if God gets credited for the good, what do we do with the absence of good? And that tension is real. And scripture doesn't pretend otherwise. Um, but it also refuses to treat God as a moral peer, somebody whose actions we evaluate from outside the story. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8 and 9, and I know you know this, I know you've heard it. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, that verse has been used to shut people down, but that's not what it's doing. It's not saying stop asking. It's saying you're not standing at the same vantage point. There's a difference between being sovereign and being culpable. When scripture speaks of God's sovereignty, it means nothing exists outside his knowledge or authority. It doesn't mean that he's the author of evil the way a human would be. It doesn't mean suffering is automatically instructional. What I hear in what you're describing isn't rebellion, it's the exhaustion of carrying grief and then being handed a spiritual performance review on top of it. And that's not God. That's people trying to tidy up something that doesn't fit their categories. When someone says, maybe there's a lesson, or maybe your faith will grow, they think they're protecting God's goodness. But what they're actually doing is protecting themselves from discomfort. Because unexplained suffering threatens that illusion that faith guarantees predictable outcomes. So the weight shifts from why did this happen to how are you responding to it? And that shift can feel like blame even when it isn't spoken outright. So let me say this clearly. Your loss is not evidence of spiritual failure. And your grief is not a test that you're required to pass correctly. But here's where I have to draw a careful line. The tension that you feel, the inconsistency you see, does not mean that God is absent from responsibility. It means we are not positioned to interpret responsibility the way we interpret human fault. If God were fully explainable and fully defensible on our terms, fully accountable to our moral logic in the way another human would be, then he wouldn't be God. He would be subject to us. And scripture simply does not grant us that position. That doesn't silence the ache. It doesn't resolve the devastation. And I need to say this personally, not just pastorally. I have a daughter who will never walk. She will never speak. Severe cerebral palsy is not something that resolves with enough time or enough faith. I don't understand why. I don't have an explanation that makes it all feel fair. But I refuse to turn her condition into a spiritual lesson just to make it easier to explain. There are days I would give anything for the story to be different. So when I say God's ways are higher than mine, I'm not saying that from a distance. I'm saying that from inside something I never would have chosen. My faith doesn't rest on understanding her condition. It rests on believing that God's goodness is not reduced by my lack of explanation. Because it reframes the direction of the question. Instead of asking, is God inconsistent? The deeper question becomes, am I willing to trust that his vantage point is not mine? And that's not an easy shift. It's not one that people make quickly, especially not in the aftermath of loss. But it's the difference between wrestling within faith and relocating authority outside of it. And that kind of leads into the next tension that sits underneath both of these. Because if God's ways are higher, if his vantage point is beyond ours, then this third question we're going to address rises up almost immediately. Why does it feel like questioning him crosses a line? I mean, I think that was kind of the question you brought up. So let's talk about that.
So, what this question really exposes for me is the cost of being honest, because questioning God doesn't just feel risky spiritually. I mean, it's risky socially. Like it costs something. When I say out loud that I am angry, that I don't understand, that I do not appreciate how this story has unfolded, I can feel that shift. I mean, it feels like I move from grieving to labeled as unsafe because now I'm not the strong one. I'm not the faithful one. I'm not the inspiring one. Honesty makes me unpredictable. It makes people unsure of what to do with me or how to feel around me. And there is a fear in that, like a real one, a fear of being labeled bitter, rebellious, spiritually immature, faithless, even. I mean, there's this spoken line that feels like you could be sad, but don't be confrontational. You can be hurting, but don't sound angry at God. You can struggle, but don't question. And I feel that line every time I decide whether or not I should say what I'm actually thinking. Most times I don't actually say it, which we both know is not normal for me. Rarely do I care what others think of me, but in faith, it's different for me because once you're labeled, it kind of sticks. People stop hearing grief and they start hearing defiance. They stop hearing someone in pain and they start hearing someone with accusations. And I don't want to be misunderstood, but I also don't want to lie. I mean, that's the struggle I deal with, trying to grieve and make sense of this life that I've been given, but also be a good Christian. Honesty costs belonging sometimes. Like it costs the version of me that people are comfortable with. And sometimes it costs my own sense of stability because once I say the question out loud, I can't pretend I don't feel it. But staying silent costs something too. I feel like silence costs my integrity. Like I lose my authenticity. Silence costs the ability to look at myself and know I didn't shrink to make other people comfortable. Because again, under literally any other circumstance, I wouldn't even think twice about being my whole and completely authentic, loud, and opinionated self. So when I ask why questioning God feels like rebellion, what I'm really asking is, why does being honest about my faith feel like I'm breaking the rules? Because I'm not trying to overthrow anything. I'm trying to survive what happened. And if my faith can't handle my honesty, then what kind of faith is that?
Whitney, the fact that you're even wrestling with whether honesty is allowed tells me something. It tells me that you still care about the relationship. People who have actually walked away don't worry about whether they're breaking the rules. They don't they don't feel the cost of saying something out loud. They just disengage. The tension you're describing, that fear of being labeled, of being misunderstood, as being seen as unsafe, that isn't rebellion. That's someone who still values belonging. And I need to say this clearly. Honesty is not the enemy of faith, but posture matters. There's a difference between anger being spoken inside relationship and anger that severs that relationship. Okay. Scripture makes room for anger. The Psalms are full of it. How long? Why have you hidden your face? Where are you? Those aren't polished prayers. They're raw. They're angry. What makes them faith is not the tone, it's the direction. They're spoken to God, not about him from a distance. That distinction matters because questioning God does not automatically equal rebellion. But questioning God while positioning ourselves as the final judge of his goodness, that's where the shift happens. And most people don't make that shift intentionally. It happens subtly. When anger stops being conversation and starts becoming verdict. What I hear from you isn't verdict, it's grief. And grief is loud sometimes. Grief is not spiritually immature, it's human. Where I think faith communities often fail is here. We don't know how to sit with unpredictable pain. We prefer inspiring faith, composed faith, the kind that makes sense in a testimony. But real faith isn't always composed. Sometimes it's disoriented. Sometimes it sounds like protest. Sometimes it's barely hanging on. And that doesn't make it unsafe, it makes it honest. Now, here's where I want to be clear without being harsh. Faith can handle honesty. But faith is not the same thing as emotional transparency. Faith is not just saying what you feel. Faith is choosing where you direct what you feel. You can be angry. You can say you don't understand. You can say you don't like how the story unfolded, but if the anger remains turned toward God in relationship, that's lament. If it turns into settled conclusion that God is unjust and unworthy, that becomes something else. And that's not about protecting God. It's about recognizing that faith requires trust in God's character, even when his actions are beyond us. You said something right there at the very end, that last question, that matters deeply. If my faith can't handle my honesty, what kind of faith is that? And I would say this: if your faith still brings your honesty to God instead of away from him, that's not fragile faith. That's costly faith. And costly faith is often the most real kind. And I think that's a good spot to kind of talk about something else important. There are questions we haven't touched yet. Not because they don't matter, but because answering them responsibly requires more space than this episode can hold. I think this is going to be a long one anyway.
Yeah.
So let's just talk for a minute about what we're not answering and why, because there are more questions on the table than we addressed today, and we've had some of these conversations outside of the podcast. Um, some of these questions are enormous. Questions about hell, questions about divine violence, about why blood is tied to atonement, about the tree in the garden and foreknowledge and whether choice is real. And we touched on that a little bit. Um, about whether Christianity is constructed or revealed. And those aren't side issues, and they're not questions that I'm trying to dodge. Um, but I'm also not going to pretend that they can be handled responsibly in just a few minutes of a podcast episode. Um, if I tried to rapid fire answers right now, it wouldn't be thoughtful. It would just feel reactive. And that's not what we're doing here. We chose to sit with the questions uh, that are shaping lived faith, prayer, and suffering, and honesty and authority, because those are the ones that I think kind of underlie everything you're carrying, and probably that people listening are carrying in real time. Those other questions, they deserve their own space, and maybe somewhere down the road we get to those. But I think they deserve more than sound bites or defensive summaries. They deserve actual conversations.
Yeah, and I don't want quick answers. I mean, quick answers are part of what made some of this harder for me in the first place. So, leaving some of those questions open right now, I don't think that's avoidance. I know some of them may not even have answers at all. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between refusing to answer something and refusing to shrink it. Um, I don't want to shrink them. I don't think you want to shrink them. We're not shrinking them. If if you're out there listening and you have questions and you're thinking, but what about this or what about that? Yeah, we know. We know.
We know.
Get it? We get it. We're just not going to rush complexity to make ourselves sound settled. Um, so I guess as we wrap this up, I want to ask you something, not as a pastor, but just as me, as your friend, the one who kind of was just there when these conversations started. After saying all of this out loud, where are you actually standing right now? Like, not in theory, not in debate, just personally.
I honestly don't know. I mean, I feel like I am leaning one way, not necessarily the way that you would prefer me to be leaning, honestly. I mean, I definitely don't have the clarity that I used to have. I'm not really ready to declare anything like one way or the other, but my faith is definitely something I'm struggling with. I mean, it's taken several hits. I honestly, I don't have any idea, but I guess I'd rather be honest about it than, have fake certainty.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm not gonna try to interpret it for you. I don't think faith is measured by how settled someone sounds. I don't think honesty disqualifies you from belonging. What I do believe is this: the fact that these questions still matter to you says something. People who truly don't care don't wrestle. They detach, they disengage, and you haven't done that because we're still having these conversations. Now, I can't define where your faith is. That's yours to articulate. But from where I stand, I still believe God's character doesn't shrink just because we don't understand him. I still believe his goodness isn't fragile, and I still believe that wrestling, even when it feels disruptive, is closer to faith than apathy ever is.
That's fair.
That doesn't solve the tension, it doesn't fix the loss, but it keeps the conversation open, and maybe for now that's where we stay. We'll see you next week.